because this is less of like a technical step-by-step lesson, please share your opinions, ask questions, anything like that. Um, so we're not as pressed for time as we have been in the past. So I really gained an appreciation for shadows when drawing still lives. And I think something that really kind of had like a profound impact on the way I think about shadows was drawing a sphere. I was drawing a sphere over and over again, and I could not get it right. And finally, my instructor pointed out that even though you would think that spheres are the darkest at their very bottom, there's actually light reflecting often off the area around the sphere back up at it. And so there's actually it actually gets lighter towards the base. And it was that kind of just suggestion about light bouncing off and shadows not being just like this blanket that gets dropped onto something that really changed the way I see shadows and kind of appreciate them. So we're gonna just explore shadows and try to understand them a little bit, like the logic behind them. And we don't have to make in renderings shadows as photorealistic as we might be seeing it here, but understanding the logic behind them is going to really help us in tricking the eye. You know, something else I'd like to point out about the shadow is just how it fades eventually in the distance. It's not just one solid straight or hard line. And that's something we'll play with in Photoshop later. So these illustrations I got from a book, Landscape Graphics, by Grant Reed, and I will show you a link. There's actually a free PDF version of this book if you're interested in learning how to draw graphics, particular to landscape design. And because I think we've been drawing so many similarities between Photoshop and painting and drawing, it's pretty natural for us to just look at these illustrations in a simplified form to start to understand shadows. So I think one of the first kind of important things to consider when creating shadows is that there's often intermediate zones of shadows. So there's often more than one kind of tone of darkness or shade of darkness. And so they kind of show you this in this illustration. If the light was coming kind of from the back and on back top onto this bench looking thing, we get a deep shadow on one side of the box and a light shadow on the other. And this kind of has there's two reasons for this that it's important. One is for helping kind of create that photorealistic look, but also it helps create some contrast and definition within your shape. And I think this just kind of very simplified version of exploring shadows kind of shows how when you have like those three different shades of shadows, you can really start to define that shape and give it a little bit of a formal context. Shadows also help illustrate the texture and form of an object. So in this kind of rock drawing, the really gradual gradient change on the outside of these rocks suggests a smooth and round shape. And also notice how the illustrator used like bouncing light and avoided having a casted shadow to help create some contrast between the rocks in the more of the foreground or in front of the bigger rock in the back. And so we can use shadows as a way to create contrast and also communicate or suggest textures and shapes. And this is, I think, is important when we're using some of our past techniques with Photoshop and kind of filling in textures is that we can start to suggest shapes on these flat textures we get from online sources by using our shadows. And on this rock, the hard kind of edges and hard lines are created by high contrast between shadows on different surfaces. So not only do we have this light, almost no shadow on the top, and this kind of these light shadows on the sides, suggesting that our light is coming from kind of directly in front of us. But we have a little bit down here of a reflection of the light from the rock surface. So we're kind of creating gradients within these shadows. I think it's also important to see that the shadow that's casted is the darkest shadow of them all. And this is because there's no light reflecting at all. It's the complete absence of light, or near complete. So yeah, as this cube kind of shows, the casted shadow is often the darkest. Although this can get kind of complicated when you have more than one source of light and casted shadows start to overlap. I think this drawing also does a nice job of just really simplifying kind of the way angles work on shadows, but in our Photoshop exercises, we can kind of go more off of sort of intuition and what feels right when creating shadows. So I'd like to ask you all, someone kind of, now that like we're starting to think about shadows, could you share what's wrong with this illustration?
There's no shadow on the tree, and the angle is very off-putting. I don't think you would have a direct, that looks a little more like a reflection than a shadow because it's directly underneath. It would
Yep.
spread out towards you more if even if the sun was sending the shadow towards you.
Yeah,
It'd be in
exactly.
perspective.
Exactly. And that's exactly what they wrote, almost word for word, in the book, that shadows should not be coming straight towards you in that way. They should be kind of getting bigger while they come towards you. And also, if that shadow was coming towards you, that tree should also be shaded, which it's not. And so they compare it to this tree illustration where we have the shadow going off to the side, and we can see that the canopy is illuminated by light that's sort of in our direction. So these are just like general kind of things to try to start thinking about when you start to create shadows and renderings. Thank you, Clark. So I think since you all met Murphy, Mr. Muber, we can use him as a way to learn a couple things about shadows. So when we're looking at this photo of the super cute puppy, I think the first important thing to kind of notice is that oftentimes when we're starting to make shadows, we think of light as white and shadows as black or gray, and that's rarely ever the case. Shadows are often a bluish to purple hue because there's a little bit of blue from the sky reflecting onto our shadows. And this is sort of an extreme version of it because this photo was taken during a sunset. But you can see that the light is orange in this picture and the shadows are actually like a blue color. And so in renderings, often I'll add a cooler kind of bluish purple color when I'm creating my shadows, because that is often the kind of color that you'll see in real life and also in like paintings and still lives. So also just thinking about shadows, we have the light coming in to Murphy from the right, and we can see that on the right side of his body. And I think it's important to think about shadows as not just the shadow that's casted, right? There's actually multiple surfaces and there's kind of multiple events happening to create those shadows. So we have the light coming in from one side, and Murphy is fairly symmetrical. So the one side of his face that is bright is kind of creating a shadow on the right side of his body, which is in the shade, so it's dark. And then because he's stopping that light from passing through him, it's being casted onto the sand. And so just from this light here, we have a few different sort of events happening on different surfaces of this photo. And so for like quick renderings in Photoshop, this isn't necessarily something you need to really tackle. But when it comes to like studio and you're trying to make a photorealistic rendering, put in the extra time to start to consider how all these different surfaces interact with each other and explore light, because it'll really help kind of take your rendering to another level. And we'll kind of explore how to make, how to work with these types of shadows and lighting a little bit later today. Thank you, Murphy. So yeah, today in Photoshop, we're going to tackle using shapes to create shadows, casting shadows, and then a little bit of dodge and burn. But before we do that, I want to show you a video that kind of really blew my mind when thinking about Photoshop as a tool. And then we'll see what else we have going for us. Let's see. Oh yeah, I just wanted to show you, this was the book that I had referenced, Landscape Graphics, Plan, Section, and Perspective. And let's see, if you look that up, there's actually a free PDF download. It looks like there's multiple. I did check this one out and I can share the link in the chat in case you're curious.